Hi guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Lillian. I'm an American based in Singapore. I've lived here for a few years, and at the start of the pandemic, I decided to start this channel as a way to talk about the books that I've been reading. So every month I put out a new video where I just chit chat a bit about what I liked, what I didn't like. I've been doing a lot of reading about Singapore. I also am a big fiction fan, so I read a lot of contemporary fiction, read a fair amount of memoirs, science fiction. So if that's what you like to read, or if you just want to listen to me kind of chat about my thoughts, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and keep on watching to hear about what I read in the month of July. I am so excited to talk about this first book. My dear friend, Ginny Fast, sent me this copy as soon as it came out because one of her good friends is the author. The first book I want to talk about is called Gold Diggers by Sanjena Sathian, and it came out this year, if I'm not mistaken. Let me check. When did it come out? Yeah, April 6th, 2021, so hot off the presses. I'll read you the little blurb so that you can kind of get a good sense of the main premise. So this is just the blurb off Goodreads. And they describe the book as an Indian American magical realist coming of age story spanning 2 continents, 2 coasts, and 4 epochs. In razor sharp and deeply funny prose, Sathian captures what it is to grow up as a member of a family, of a diaspora, and of the American meritocracy. So maybe just a bit in my own words what this book is about. The book is actually split into 2 chunks, and so the first chunk, we follow the main character and the narrator, Neil, throughout the entire story, but the first chunk is his high school years in a suburb of Atlanta, if I'm not mistaken, and the second chunk, we fast forward 10 years, and he's a grad student in Berkeley, California. What I really loved about Sathian's world building is that she captures this community in such a raw and realistic way that I just feel that it's quite authentic and genuine, even though I myself am not a part of that community. I can tell that with the level of specificity that she gives these scenes that she's portraying, the number of kind of proper nouns that she's injecting into the prose, where she'll specifically name drop a certain suburb or a school or, the burger joint everyone goes to. You can feel that she's really painting a picture of a community, a time, a place, a feeling. The first chunk of this novel takes place in the early 2000s, and that's also when I was coming of age or when I was in high school. And so a lot of that inner dialogue that Neil has and his worries and his concerns, and also the immense pressure he feels as a child of immigrants who are viewed as model minorities in certain respects, really resonated with me. And I think she does a great job of capturing that time and that place, and also that time in his life and kind of the anxieties he might be feeling, and also the opportunity that he thinks is ahead but is also tinged with cynicism and uncertainty. I don't want to give too much away about the plot because I do feel there's an element of magical realism that I didn't know was going to happen going into it, and the reveal was pretty cool. I mean, it happens pretty early on, so I think it's okay to let you guys know about it, but the basic plot, I would sum it up as really a story of growing up in a community where certain expectations of success are spelt out to you very early on, and feeling kind of torn between both the home country of your parents, the immigrant experience that they went through, and then your lived experience as kind of an Indian American, but then culturally you feel quite American, and how to navigate those expectations and understand like what do you actually even want for yourself, and how to basically survive in such an intense pressure cooker. All of the ambition of previous generations kind of funneling themselves into you, and how to navigate all of those kind of conflicting dynamics. And I would say that this idea of ambition and want and kind of this ingrained desire to be powerful almost in a sense and successful is a driving force of the book, because basically what happens is there is this mystical alchemy that has been passed down to Anita and Anita's mother, Anjali, who is kind of in the same community as Neil, whereby if they steal the gold of an ambitious person or a person with certain strengths and then melt it down through this ritual and then drink it as a sort of lemonade, which is a very cool like metaphor for like the entrepreneurship of, you know, an American child setting up a lemonade stand and like the ambition there, and kind of the like juxtaposition of American pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and then also the like tenacity of the immigrant experience, and then also the Indian American community really trying to carve out success for themselves in the United States. Anyway, that's a tangent. This kind of lemonade allows the drinker to then steal or capture the ambition or whatever kind of strong suits or characteristics of the person that the gold belonged to. I'll start with the high points of this book. For one, I'll say it's the first novel I've read in a while where I really wanted to know what was happening next, and I really was curious and interested in both Neil, his friendship with Anita, but also this community. And also I feel that the novel was jam-packed with a lot of themes that I found really compelling, in addition to wanting to figure out how the plot was going to unfold. I have read a few reviews that were kind of annoyed by Neil's voice, because Neil is a very like kind of lost character who doesn't really know what he wants, and is able to tap into this potion to get some of the ambition for himself, but then kind of becomes addicted to it. So he's not the most sympathetic character if you're like kind of a type A person and you want someone who like is striving and has goals. But that's what I liked about him. I'm kind of in a period in my life where I also feel lost and like unsure of what my path forward is. And that's definitely a time that Sathian captures really well in Neil's adolescent life, is feeling as if there are a lot of external expectations for he should go to Duke, he should study XYZ, probably medicine, and then get married to another Indian American. But he just feels this overwhelming sense of like, what does it matter? Like, what's the script for me that should be written? And he doesn't really feel pulled towards anything until he gets interested in American history later on, and he kind of is able to see himself in American history through this tale that he hears about, which is an Indian who supposedly had come to the United States during the gold rush and was one of the first Asians who panned for gold. He's called the Bombayan, and that's kind of a mythical tale that's told, but also something that Neil is trying to ascertain whether this actually happened in history. And that's because I think Neil kind of sees himself in that story. But a lot of the inner dialogue and feeling lost and feeling unambitious, but then when being presented with like a quick, easy fix, like this drug that immediately lets him steal the strong and empowered characteristics of other people who are successful, he wants it. And so kind of wanting something, but wanting to get it really easily and without having to work for it, I think is kind of one of the, it's important to the story that his personality is fleshed out in that way. And it's also something that I related to, I guess, because one of the key themes in presenting this potion that then allows you to steal the success of others is, when is it enough? Like, all of these characters that are able to drink the lemonade kind of become addicted to it, or they have to really self-regulate to make sure they don't just become a junkie. And then another key component to that is, how do you know that you're fully leveraging what you stole from someone else? Like if you stole someone's ability to really concentrate and do well on your SATs and then get into the school of your dreams, like, is that enough? Are you making it worthwhile? Like, given that you have taken this from someone else, that you have to use it. And I think that's something that haunts Neil and some of the other characters, because what they're doing is really kind of messed up. They're essentially taking this shortcut instead of hard work, instead of struggle. Drinking this potion allows Neil to have a shortcut towards success. And it's kind of upsetting to think about, if I'm the person being stolen from, to then have that taken away, and to have had such bright prospects then unexplainably disappear. And you do see a contrast in how Neil's approach to this magical potion versus Anita and her mother, who are much more cautious and measured about it. But just that main premise was really fascinating to me, because I myself sometimes feel like I've lived a very lucky life, and that was something that was almost arbitrarily just given to me. And it's kind of as if I just drank a magical potion and was able to achieve certain things. Like, obviously I work hard or whatever, but the arbitrariness of just being able to drink a potion and then gain access to success or gain access to wealth and power does kind of mirror onto how there's a lot of inequality in today's society through pure chance and pure luck as well. Even though I'm not from this community, feel like she did a really good job of depicting certain really interesting cultural phenomenons, which I'm obsessed with. Like, I just love thinking and talking about identity and, like, what does it mean to be Chinese American but to not speak Chinese or have never been to China? What does it mean to be Singaporean Chinese? Like, how do people self-identify? And as a mixed race Asian, like, do I identify as Asian at all? And just all of that stuff I find very interesting. And I think there was a lot of thought put into how to depict that in this story. I loved kind of the description of Miss Teen India, and kind of the question always being like, what does it mean to be both Indian and American? And I just loved her descriptions of that community, like the children of first generation immigrants. And I just feel like she did a really good job of capturing like what it felt like to be a teen in the early 2000s, but also to be like Indian American or Chinese American. Like, I could see some parallels, and I think she just did it in such a like vibrant and accurate way that even though I'm not from that community, I can like totally imagine that that's what it was like. Like, I did have some friends who are Indian American where I grew up, and I just feel like she captured it in a really authentic way. And she does have some interesting passages about being a conceptual orphan. Like, both Anita and Neil don't really know like where they came from. Like, on the one side, there's so much at almost like a superficial level, like nods to their heritage. Like when Neil's sister gets married, like she goes to this big expo where she can pick out her lehenga and like all of the Indian garb and like the jewelry. But then at the same time, they're like very American to the core in certain like mannerisms and cultures, cultural expressions. And so not feeling like fully connected to the culture of your parents, not really having the language. I don't think there was the language in the early 2000s to speak about being Indian American or Chinese American, to really like describe that as its own community. And so therefore you just don't see yourself in American history, or you don't see yourself in the history of the country you now call your own, or is your own. You were born there. And so that kind of idea of being a conceptual orphan, I feel like was pretty weighty in this book. In terms of downsides, I would say the only downside for me is I think the prose was great in building this world and capturing these very raw and realistic components and details of the community, but at times too dense, because what I would do is I want to know what's going to happen next in the plot. Like, the plot has really hooked me. And so what I would do is like skim so I could find out what was going to happen next. And then like the next day go back to where I had started skimming from and like read closely because I wanted to absorb the prose. And so maybe that's just a me problem, but I do feel like maybe she could have tamped down on the level of description and the level of like, you know, the type of writing where instead of saying like going to the supermarket, you say like going to Kroger. There's a lot of usage of proper nouns to build the world. And I think partly maybe the issue is like that level of specificity wasn't necessarily for me, because she does a lot of, I think, referring to specific foods or, I don't know, behaviors or like places that would be immediately recognizable to that community, like to Indian Americans or Indians growing up in the US. And because I just like don't speak Tamil or Hindi or whatever, it just like goes straight over my head. Which is fine. That just means that it doesn't have like that level of specificity doesn't really work for me as a reader, but I don't think she should change that. Like, that's fine for her to have written this book for her community and for people who would pick up on stuff like that. But it's just because I'm a little bit impatient and I want to find out what's happening. I was kind of like, okay, I'll come back and read this like dense, beautiful prose later, but let me just see what happens next so that I can like get to bed on time and not stay up all night reading. I really recommend this book, especially if you are the daughter of Chinese parents or the son of Indian parents. I think you'll relate hard, like, and you're a millennial, like you're 30, like we are, like you will relate hardcore to a lot of this stuff. And it's kind of fun. Like, I think at this point we have a few friends that have written novels, and it's kind of fun to see them depict their childhoods, because it's our childhood. And so I don't know, I think definitely if you find yourself in that demographic, I highly recommend it, but I also recommend it to anyone who wants a really well thought out, well crafted novel with really beautiful elements of surprise and surrealism, and also I think would warrant a second read. I think there are a lot of images or symbols, a lot. She really mines the imagery of gold and ambition and power. So I think upon a second reading, a lot of those connections will be made clearer to me. And there's definitely a lot of thought put into the themes around what it means to be an immigrant in the US, what it means to survive / even try to thrive with so many expectations put on you. And it definitely packs a conceptual punch, which I really appreciate, because that's hard to do, to write something well, also have a lot of themes, and then also have the plot carry it forward. I don't think the pacing in the plot is perfect, but I think given that it's doing all these things at once, it was really satisfying outcome. I'm gonna rate this a 4.7 out of 5. A big thank you to Ginny for sending me this copy of this book. I highly recommend everyone check it out. The next book I'm going to talk about is actually a collection of short stories. This is the book that I read this month about Singapore. I read every month, I try to read a book about Singapore. It can be fiction, nonfiction, anything, but I try to always have one book that's about Singapore. It's called Balik Kampung 2A, and that's because there is an original collection called Balik Kampung, and then the second edition, they split into 2A and 2B, and I think there's even a 2C at this point. These are short story, People and Places, that's the name of this collection. And they are an anthology of fiction stories edited by Verena Tay. And the People and Places version, each chapter is meant to be about a neighborhood or a part of Singapore that is important to the author. And I think that the author has grown up in that neighborhood or has lived there for decades and has a connection to that neighborhood. I really enjoyed reading this. Big shout out to my friend Tim. He got this for me for not my birthday, for Christmas last year, and it's taken me almost a year to get around to reading it. So thank you, Tim, for getting this really thoughtful Christmas present for me. I think that this is A great way to kind of tap into some of that nostalgia for what Singapore used to be like. And to be honest, I'm super guilty of that. I think I just love a good nostalgic short story that talks about the amas, or like when people still spoke dialect, or, you know, someone cursing in Hokkien, or like when the hawkers were actually on the street instead of in a hawker center. And I was talking to my friend Fred about this. We were wondering, like, maybe because this is kind of a restricted space when it comes to creative expression and artistic expression, sometimes you feel like modern literature in Singapore doesn't really push the boundaries. Although I would recommend Ministry of Moral Panic as an example of a collection of stories that does push the boundaries and is pretty edgy. But we noticed that there's a lot of literature that's really based on this kind of nostalgia genre and just really mining these like almost idealistic or idyllic visualizations of the past, and almost always coming from the place of like things were easier back then or things were better back then. So you do kind of have to be aware of that. Like, you are going to be kind of indulging in nostalgia, but I like that. And as someone who didn't grow up in Singapore in the 50s, it is kind of new in some respects to kind of see at least how these authors reflect or think back on their childhoods or their stories that they've heard passed down from previous generations. And these neighborhoods have changed so much that it is kind of fun to be able to recognize, like to read a story and then later in the postscript, there's a little section that says about my connection to that neighborhood. And you think like, oh, that neighborhood, like I know about that, I've been there. But the way that it's been depicted in the story is so different. And you really see how much Singapore has changed over the past 50 plus years. 80 years at this point, 70, 80 years. My favorite short story in this collection is actually the first one. It's called Peace is a Foot Reflexology Parlor by Joshua Ip. I also think the collection does a good job of portraying a pretty diverse set of voices, and I think the authors themselves do a great job of being playful but also a little bit provocative in their depictions of the Singapore of the past. They each kind of have their own take or flair about how they're going to take this theme of their connection to a neighborhood and really draw that out. Cyril Wong also contributed to this anthology. He's a pretty well-known local poet. So his short story is about a memory he had as a child of his mom shoplifting. And so he kind of replays that out, and he says it's a way of working through that trauma of being a young boy and having his mother arrested for shoplifting. Another one of the short stories that I liked a lot is called Missing by Aung Sui San. And this kind of is told through the eyes of a young girl who's, there's a foreign worker who's a driver for her family, and he goes missing, and it's told through her kind of young perspective, and it's really sweet and kind of touching. I think this is a really fun, light read. A lot of these stories are poignant or heartwarming or touching. I think it's a diverse collection told through multiple points of view. There's one about an Indian Singaporean, I think, who is a police officer. There's one about a housewife. There's one about kind of like the typical Singaporean who's like studied abroad but then has family obligations in Singapore but is so busy working that he can't always be home to take care of his family. And so I think definitely if you're living in Singapore and you want, you know, just read a couple of these when you're sitting by the pool in your condo, or just nighttime bedtime reading, I think this is a great option. I'm going to rate this a 4.6 out of 5, and I'm going to check out the other collections as well, because for me, I really like having some fiction that's about Singapore during the 80s and the 60s and the 70s, because so far I've mostly just read history and nonfiction about it. And so even though this is very much through rose-tinted glasses, I think if I'm starting from, you know, a baseline of 0, like not really knowing that much at all about what life was like back then, getting the kind of glamorized, nostalgic version is an okay place to start. The last book I read in the month of July is called The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. And this was the book that I read in my book club. The theme for book club was orphans and family, I think, or different conceptions of family. And so the plot of this book really revolves around a young girl, Lee Chen Sanders, who is mixed race Asian and who loses her mother, who has died by suicide, and is then reincarnated as a bird. And she follows this bird. She goes to Taiwan and follows the bird to try and understand more about why her mother made that choice, and a bit of her family dynamics, a little bit of her roots. It's also kind of a love story between Lee and her best friend, who she's been in love with for years, and they kind of have this very special friendship that then unfolds into more of a romance. And there's also a very strong theme of kind of understanding what's happened in the past, and she kind of can access these memories and these events that happened in her mother and her grandmother's lives that help her understand a little bit more about who she is. She also feels emotions through colors, and so she and her best friend communicate in that way. If she's feeling down or whatever, her best friend will just ask her, like, what color? And then there's a lot of descriptions of different colors in this book. It's a young adult book, but I don't think that should be an excuse. I've read a lot of good YA. My favorite YA that I've read since starting this channel is The Hate U Give. That's that's in the young adult genre, and it's so well written, and it really captures like the voice of the youth. Or I don't know, that sounded like something a boomer would say, but it like really made me feel young again. This book, I don't know, I think this book, it is more of a slight, like I think you would appreciate this book if you were a teenager, because there's a little bit of romance, there's a little bit of like magical elements, and there's a little bit of like that family drama. As an adult, it's kind of hard to latch into or latch onto. The characters are pretty one-dimensional, and the problems seem a little bit overly simplified. But I can see myself having really liked this book when I was 15 or 16, just because, well, for one, she's half Chinese, half Taiwanese, and so I think I would have been really excited by that. And secondly, I always want a good, like, bit of romance in my young adult stuff that I would read. And I think the whole, like, going home to Taiwan and, like, trying foods for the first time, or, like, not being able to speak Chinese to your grandparents would have resonated a lot more for me as a younger adult. But now I just feel like there are so much more novels about that content that are deeper and more nuanced, that it doesn't really like serve that purpose for me. I will rate this a 3.8 out of 5. I just chalk it up to not being the right genre, not being the right audience for it, although I would say a younger me probably would have enjoyed it a lot more. So those are the books that I read in the month of July. Thanks for bearing with me as the sun sets and everything gets darker. I'm still not a professional YouTuber, although I was considering getting the ring light out, but I think it just gives it a nice, I don't know, mystique as we go through this video. If you made it this far, comment down below. If you could compete in any event at the Olympics, what would it be? For me, I would do synchronized diving, I think, because it's like gymnastics, but there's also a synchronized component, and I kind of like jumping off tall platforms, so like the 10-meter platform might be kind of cool, and also you have to be crazy athletic and coordinated to do that, so that would be awesome. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit subscribe. You'll get another one in a month. If you've read any of these books, please let me know if you agreed, disagreed with what I thought. I love having some interaction and hearing from you guys. I'm definitely very open to having my opinion changed. I'm a very malleable person, and so I love to hear what people think about the books if you've also read them. And with that, I will sign off and see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching.